everyone. My name is Frank. Today's session of our Heritage. I am very happy to be here to be able to introduce our speaker, Frank Vagnone, who is going to talk to us about the green box. And we're all kind of wondering what's inside this green box or where this discussion is going, but we're very much looking forward to it. First off, I'd like to thank the Ohio Humanities Council, who provided generous support as our day sponsor today to help fund us bringing Frank in. And about Frank, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about him. Frank Vagnone is the president and CEO of Old Salem Museums and Gardens in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and board member of the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums. He is the leader of Twisted Preservation. As a domestic archaeoanthropologist, which I've never heard of before, so I'm not, a man who wears many hats, I think, who has consulted, lectured, and taught internationally at an extensive list of universities, cultural sites, museums, and community-based membership organizations. And he has co-member Ryan. Special treat for all of you in attendance today. We have 2 copies of Frank's wonderful and provocative book about how to make house museums better in the 21st century. And we'll be giving 2 copies away. 7's going to be pasting in some information on how you can win those books. So, without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Frank.
All right, thank you. And so I hope you have the PowerPoint. How's that? You can see it and you can hear me.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone who's invited me, especially Heritage Ohio that contacted me, and the Ohio Humanities, which is covering the expenditures of the talk itself. So thank you both. Today I'd like to talk about something that I've labeled the green box, and it's really a reflective moment during COVID and these really strong social currents that are occurring around us to think about nostalgia and preservation and how this time in quarantine can really be used as a way of thinking about the future for us. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional Native peoples upon which Ohio rests. I always like to give a disclaimer at the beginning of my talks, just so you know what my bias is, where I'm coming from. I've been very clear about my background, being a queer dyslexic dumpster diving sculptor who is also a public historian. And a lot of that comes together to really inform what my professional practice is like. The picture in the center is me playing baseball with my father in Gahanna, Ohio, which is outside of Columbus. And the other picture with flowers on my head was taken by one of my daughters in LA as a portrait. So today we're really talking about the space between that little boy pretending to enjoy sports and then the adult now that speaks about public history and heritage. What I'd like to do right now is to take a minute and ask everyone to please go and get a significant object and put it next to your computer. I will give you 1 minute to do that. Thank you. Thank you all. If the chat is available, if you could please just type in what your object is, that would be a really incredible thing for us to all see what our significant objects are. So while you do that, I'm actually going to proceed with the presentation. So I want to start with this quote, which says, you know, we're in a time between time and a place which is no place. And it's from Stanley Tigerman's Architecture of Exile. And it really does describe where we are at the present moment. And for me, as I said, I'm really interested in this space of quarantine being a time of reflection. And so when we talk today, understand that what I'm doing is reflecting on my work, my professional practice within public history. And I hope in some way it will be able to better inform what perhaps your next steps might be in what you do. So whether it's a Main Street program, or you run a house museum, or you're an interpreter at a history site, I'd like to think that this present discussion will allow us some safe space to really reconsider and think about what is happening around us and how that could affect our future. I'd like to start with a tiny little book. It's called A History of the Barricade. And in fact, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a quirky little book, which is a history of the barricade. And the map I'm showing you on the left is a map of the walled city of Paris in 1848. And all the dots are where barricades were placed during protests. And the illustration on the bottom starts to give us a sense of what kind of imagery we're looking at when we look at a barricade. And in the book, you know, a barricade is really a heap of disparate objects. They're just a bunch of different things. And those things are combined in a moment. And it's intermittent, which means that it just happens. And it's really impossible to set down a kind of neat, linear understanding and path to what that barricade is. And so I present this as a kind of conceptual idea for the talk today. That what I would like to do is discuss the elements in this pile of barricade. Because when you zoom in on this illustration, you see that there are kitchen spoons and chairs and horses and wagon wheels and pieces of wood and baskets. Nothing in this pile makes much sense. But what does make sense is the reason why it's there. It's there as a form of protest. And so for us to kind of think about all of the things that are happening in our world today as elements to this barricade, and how does this barricade inform our future steps? And perhaps a barrier, or it could be an asset. What I'd like to do is discuss, just in the last 4 weeks, there have been 2 unconferences, and I'm showing you some of the seminars of those unconferences. And as they scroll by, just quickly take a look at what the subjects are. And the first unconference is Dismantle Preservation, and the second one was Death to Museums. And both of these conferences were about frustrations and issues that people who work within the field of history, public history, preservation, and museums had with the establishment of these organizations. And I'm showing you some images on either side of these brands. We know very well what's going on in the world around us, where history is at the center of this we've gone from being a place that is being and assessed and quite frankly looking thing that we have worked our lives to help establish. And so in order for me to understand that, I really wanted to look at some of the King Daddy house museums and history sites that we have in the United States. And so we've got Mount Vernon, Van Cortlandt in New York City, Monticello, and Colonial Williamsburg. Even though I have the dates on there of when the house was built, and those are also the periods of interpretation, the important thing that I'd like all for us to look at is when they became house museums, because that's the important issue here. It's not the history of the house, but it's the era that the house and the history site actually became a public venue. And keep note of those years, because those years are going to have a kind of effect on how we place in context the very history sites that we work on. The next thing I'd like to do is to bring up three really important historic societies: the Colonial Dames of America, the National Society of Colonial Dames of America, and the Daughters of the American Revolution. Again, look at when these organizations were established. And what we're going to do now is look at how the notion of Americana, nostalgia, really took on its form that we're used to today. And as an example of that, I want to talk about Wallace Nutting. Wallace Nutting was born in 1861 in New England, died in 1941. He was a pastor, but what we really know Wallace Nutting for is he was the kind of progenitor of what we know of today as a house museum. But the catch here is that he also was a photographer, and I'm showing you one of his photographs on the top row. His daughters helped hand color his photographs, and they also modeled in those photographs. And his house museums were not house museums the way we know them today. In fact, his really lucrative business was that he produced reproduction colonial American furniture. And I'm showing you on the bottom row some of his furniture. So think of these house museums as IKEAs of the era, that you'd go in them, look at a piece of furniture, buy it, and take it home. And so not only was his furniture about commodification, his photographs, and both of them were producing a very strong kind of commodity of nostalgia. I circled in the top upper right-hand corner, this is during World War I, and that he was selling pictures of home from home, that they were small images that the soldiers could have in their pockets that would keep them connected to what was truly American, which was truly a kind of national identity. So what we've talked about are the beginnings of house museums, Wallace Nutting, and the formation of a kind of beginning idea of what a nationalist identity was. And so now I want to show you two very common and strong living history sites. On the left, we have Colonial Williamsburg, and on the right, we have Henry Ford's Greenfield Village. Both of them really constructed and begun operation exactly the same time. And what's important in this conversation is really that both of them are fabrications. Colonial Williamsburg was essentially, think of it as Rome. It had many, many, many eras of construction and habitation in the town of Williamsburg. And Rockefeller comes in and starts purchasing private property and eventually demolishes everything that really was seen as outside the period of interpretation. The top picture I'm showing you was a relatively new high school that was demolished to make way for what we now know as the governor's palace greenway, and I'm showing you the picture of how it exists today. This kind of demolition occurred throughout all of Williamsburg. A good number of those buildings are reproductions. Now, Greenfield Village is a complete creation outside of any historic formation and foundation. Ford bought buildings nationally, took them apart, and moved them to the site, which is Greenfield Village. So if you go to Greenfield Village now as a living history site, what you're experiencing is a complete fabrication of Americana. And it is a very tightly focused view of Americana. And especially now understanding Henry Ford's anti-Semitism, his racial bias, and his view towards capitalism and inventors, that really what you get out of Greenfield Village is an understanding that starts to define the notion of American exceptionalism. And that is that we are what we are because we are exceptional, with very little nuanced understanding of the kind of people that came into the United States. This is a really fascinating chart that I found, and it's called Human Cycles, History as Science. And what it does is it traces it to the year 2000. And what I've done is that I have inserted on top of that house museums, historic societies, and Wallace Nutting's nostalgic furniture and photography production on top of that chart. What you can see is a direct connection between what we now have as a substantial body of historic sites and house museums being created, and in some cases fabricated, during the height of cycles of violence and civil unrest. We know that Mount Vernon really became a public venue prior to the Civil War in an attempt to kind of mend the South and the North. Van Cortlandt House, which was really one of the first house museums, was formed really the very time that the 5 boroughs of New York became what we now know as New York City. And Monticello becomes a public venue right around the exact same time in 1924 that we form a national immigration policy that deeply restricts the number of immigrants that could come into the country. And Monticello is a specifically interesting example because it was owned and a big part of the PR and into the hands of true Americans. Even though the congressman, of course, couldn't be more American, he was Jewish. And so this story is really considerably interesting, as well as the Williamsburg creation. And then we get into the 1960s and 70s with civil unrest. The images on the bottom of this slide show us where most of the Confederate statues were erected. And I'm showing you those blue arrows at the bottom. The chart to the right of the Confederate statue shows us from the Southern Poverty Law Center when these statues were most created and erected. And all you have to do is start to overlap that chart on the bottom with the chart on the top. And you can see that we have a direct connection between history sites, historic house museums, nostalgic production of commodification, and Confederate statues, along with strong and solid immigration. So what this does is, just even as a quick cursory understanding, is it makes me feel like we are the guys here who produced a painting of a cow, and we're looking at the real cow, looking back at the painting of the cow, wondering why the real cow is not being enticed by the painting of the cow. Our idea, our craze, hasn't really idea of an authentic history. And that's really where those unconferences are coming from. That's really where a lot of the protests are coming from. That the sites that we have now, even though we've started to tell these stories, still don't center what it really means to be an authentic live person within this world. So our history sites really are fabrications and two-dimensional creations of a three-dimensional live situation. One thing that we're seeing now in the world of history sites is that new sites are moving away from this larger single narrative honorific idea, the Mount Vernons and Monticello, and they're trying to tell the story of difficult histories and real life situations through the individual. So the Museum of Lynchings and Mass Incarcerations, which just opened up in Birmingham, Alabama, what it does is it asks to collect soil from out time, and that has been bottled with their name on it. And so the collections of this museum are artifacts, except they're artifacts tied to the individual. So you can see that we're moving away from kind of George Washington's silver, and we're moving toward a kind of centering of the individual and centering trauma as something that is worthy of acknowledging in a museum setting. The same thing is true internationally, and this is the War Childhood Museum in Sarajevo. And the important kind of interesting and compelling notion about this museum is that it starts off quite simply by somebody asking, does anyone have any objects of significance that are tied directly to the war? And can you send a photograph and tell us about them? So what happens is that this museum, which is, it was a pop-up museum, and now I think it's just found a permanent location, that the objects are really what we would consider fairly insignificant objects, but they're incredibly significant to the individuals who are presenting those objects. And so, for instance, we're looking at ballet slippers from somebody who was not allowed to practice ballet any longer because their ballet school was destroyed, or someone who loved going to the library and when they went to the library, it had been destroyed. And so these objects have a direct connection to the individual and have a greater meaning tied to the individual rather than a kind of larger understanding of the collective national idea of what the war did.
I had thousands of photos, but I've been doing it for months and nobody was paying attention. One day, I I started a page called Humans of New York. We started getting 1 new fan a day, 2 new fans a day. And I said, forget everything else. This is what's working for me. And so I just started uploading my pictures directly to Facebook. And then all of a sudden it just... Do you remember the happiest moment of your life?
Paige passed me the puck and then I shot and scored.
Super late. I think, we walk down the street and we see all these people and we do kind of wonder about their stories, the celebrations and the victories, and that's what people are engaging with. What's your greatest challenge right now?
I don't think about it. We just go day to day.
What's the hardest part about math?
Fractions.
Fractions?
Yes, I hate fractions.
I hate fractions too. What I really hope to maintain is the culture of positivity, of celebration and support that these people share.
So this video documents Humans of New York, and it's another example of how, even in social media and pop culture, the storytelling has begun to move away from national identity to the individual, and not just the individual of import, but me and your sister and my average everyday, more authentic entities that have been portrayed in our history sites. And even in our attempts to add individual stories to our pre-existing history sites, we haven't quite gotten to the core understanding that the individual stories are really what can draw audiences and interest and long-term sustainability to our history sites. Here because not only in terms of interpretation, we restore and preserve our buildings. The top is an artist out of New York City, which is called The Ethics of Dust. And what he does is he goes and takes latex, puts it on top of artifacts, pulls off the grunge and the debris, and then that becomes an artifact in itself. So the time accumulated dust, dirt, and decay on things that we have traditionally considered important are now starting to be seen as more important than the things that we have chosen to preserve and honor as examples of a national identity. And the video on the bottom with the book, the video is of how this small book, it's called An Attempt at Exhausting a Place in Paris. Basically, this poet sits on a park bench and simply writes what he sees. It is quite simply a listing of everything that is experienced, from the sounds to the birds to the numbers on the buses. And that the movement of an environment as a kind of honorific space of authenticity authenticity is being seen in its details. So just like the ethics of dust, the way one starts to see historic environments or historic districts or main streets or historic sites really is starting to have a kind of shifting of perspective. So now the green box. The green box is actually my special object. And the reason why I bring it up in this presentation is I received this box after a dear uncle of mine passed away, and it was a collection of items that his father, my great-grandfather, kept. And for some reason, the family considers me as a historian of family history, and so they sent it to me. I looked through it very quickly, put it aside, but the quarantine time has really allowed me some space for reflection. And so I went into my file cabinet and pulled out the green metal box. And I started to look through it. Now, I'm quickly showing you my list of details, the outline of the specifics of what was inside of the box. So it ranged from all eras of photographs, a recording of my grandfather speaking to his children and grandchildren, a handwritten script, and photographs that ranged all the way from the bottom left, which is in the small row, my grandfather at his 70th birthday, to the two pictures above that, he on his wedding day, and then later on in life. It also, oddly, has a picture of me, which is in the center, in my bedroom in Charlotte, North Carolina, very close to when I graduated from undergrad in college. And so as I started to go through these fragments of my family's history, my first museum sense was I need to make some linear sense out of this. I need to put these in order. I need to understand these in a way that has a beginning, middle, and end. Well, what I quickly got to was the power, strength, and authenticity of that green box didn't come from a linear understanding. What the power did reside in was an understanding of these as fragments. Now, when I got the box, I started to really try to understand my family's history in a way that I really didn't comprehend. And as a historian, I went straight to research. And this is a newspaper opinion piece in an Ohio paper. And it talks about Italians. Why? Because my family is of Italian immigrant stock. And in this newspaper article, it says that the experiment of importing them, the Italians, into the Hocking Valley will prove a costly one. As a rule, Italian laborers are ignorant and vicious. They know nothing of our language and seem to be incapable of learning it. Very few of them know enough to read and write their own language. And of course, this is just one of many forms of bias and xenophobia that existed in the public realm at this time. The picture on the right is a photograph of Chicago street cleaners. At this time, roughly around 90% of all of the Chicago street cleaners were Sicilian Italians. There was an article that said Italians were only good to sweep up the horse crap from the streets, and to act as ballast on the barges for trash. And so within this cultural environment, my family immigrates from Italy. I have one branch which immigrates from Sicily, Palermo, and the other branch which immigrates from an area around Rome. Now, the reason why this is kind of valuable in this discussion is because they both land in central Ohio. One of them lands in Columbus, and the other one lands in a very small town called Shawnee, Ohio. Never quite understood why this happened, and never understood why specifically Ohio. And when you look at Palermo and Rome and you understand the cosmopolitan feel of those cities, landing in Shawnee, Ohio, although still a constructed town with strong commercial aspects, it was not where they came from. And I'm always really interested in transportation and behaviors in public history. And at the bottom, I'm showing you from the right, Italian immigrants getting on the boat in Sicily, being on the boat transatlantic, landing in Ellis Island, but of course they could have landed in Philadelphia or Baltimore or a number of other spots. And then finally, the best way and probably the most efficient way to get to central Ohio was from train. And I'm showing you a historic photograph of the train in the Shawnee, Ohio train station. There were a handful of them. So I don't really know which one my family landed. And so the specificity of this move from Italy to central Ohio, and I'm going to concentrate specifically on Shawnee, Ohio. And the reason is because this is really why the Italian immigrants were coming to central Ohio. And there was a very concerted effort, and I'm sure there are historians on this presentation that know far more about this than I do, so I apologize in not getting all of the details correct. But the clay belt in Ohio was producing some of the most significant brick and tile products for North America. And Zanesville was the center of this brick and tile production. And of course, Shawnee, Ohio is around 30 miles south of Zanesville. And as I looked through the green box, I started to find clues about Shawnee, Ohio. I had done a bit of research before, and there was no record, no photographic record, nothing that would show us that the Guzzo family lived in Shawnee, Ohio from almost the entirety of their life from immigration until death. The only physical remains that I had was this photograph, which was taken by Rob Duchamp from the Shawnee Historical Society, who unfortunately has passed away, but he was invaluable in helping me locate my family's history. But the only thing that he could do was photograph the remains of a foundation. So for a while, that's all that I had. Well, in that green box, I found the only photograph that anyone has seen of the house that the Guzzos lived in. And the house itself is significant because it existed in a ghettoed area called Italyville outside of Shawnee, Ohio. And so what I'm showing you here is a Google image. On the far left, I've labeled Italyville. There's really nothing left of it. I showed you a foundation wall. And as most ghettoized places of living, it was actually placed between the Shawnee Cemetery, which you can see above Italyville, and the red dashed line, which is the railroad track. What's interesting is that there is family history that my great-grandfather, Father John Guzzo, always walked to and from work carrying his black lunchbox on the railroad tracks. And so on the picture on the top row right, I'm showing you Italyville with the star, and the other star is the clay craft site where he worked for his entire life. And the dashed line shows you the railroad tracks that he walked back and forth. And the bottom row is showing you the kind of physical track. And something that I never quite understood, but as I investigated it further, I did, that his reliance on the railroad track was so he didn't walk through the town, that his segregation remained constant. In fact, this segregation remained constant throughout his entire life. Neither he nor his wife learned English, and he died on his way back from work on the railroad track. So it's not just the house or the Claycraft site or Shawnee, Ohio, or the railroad track. It's actually the combination of behaviors and historic information that produced the narrative of the Guzzos in Shawnee, Ohio. Also in that green box, found with the photograph of the house that the Guzzos lived in, were around 5 sheets of handwritten paper. And after a lot of kind of reading and analysis, I realized that these were written by my grandfather, Dominic DiCarlo, late in his life. And in fact, he dated them May 18th, 1978. And what these are is a script that he kept editing to contact his boss, Mr. Grant, and you can see Mr. Grant's name at the top left, to tell him that he had hurt himself on the job. And at the time, he was a headstone setter in the cemetery. He was around 70 years old. He had hurt himself. And he was trying to explain to his boss that this injury occurred on the job, and he was asking for medical assistance and for his final check. And the response was, if you can't do the work, go home. And my grandfather passed away a month later. So these documents are really kind of setting a narrative of how a marginalized person, for many reasons, Italian, age, economic level, education level, was denied a kind of adequate attention. And so this document is much more than just a primary document that we would have in our collections. It speaks to a much larger narrative, just like the railroad track in Shawnee. And then probably one of the most odd that I found in the green box was a photograph of me. And here I am, skinny, young, and full of hair. And you know, my first reaction was, oh, he just kept a photograph of me. Our generation is really one of the first generations that went on to advanced education, master's degree. And so that had some meaning. But beyond that, I looked at the face of the individual, young me, and I thought that I was keeping it secret about my same-sex attraction. And then I look at the objects that surrounded me. And I've got an artist's wash, Beaux-Arts lithograph of the Parthenon, hand-painted ceramic plates, and hand-carved Chinese wood sculptures. And what occurred to me was, in looking at this picture, that I thought I was keeping it secret when in fact the artifacts in the environment were giving it away. And so in this photograph, beyond just the surface of me and the year and that it was in my bedroom, that the objects themselves took on a meaning that was really divorced from the kind of decorative arts meaning. And the reason why all of this is really stunning to me is if you look behind me right now in my image, you will see in my office a mantle. And on that mantle, I have the Beaux-Arts print, the hand-painted ceramic plate, and the hand-carved Chinese lion. I have kept these objects my entire life. And so I started to think, how would one understand the importance of those objects in my individual historic narrative? And how would I, as a museum colleague, understand that objects existed outside of their physicality, just like the Guzzo's house existed outside of the physicality of its existence? So this green box, in investigating it, took on far greater meaning than I ever imagined when I opened it up. So the house in Shawnee, Ohio, and the only picture of the Guzzo family with 6 kids. The house on Broad Street, their house on Sundale, my house with me in the bedroom and my artifacts. And so in this green box is this kind of mixed up, messy, non-linear understanding of what it means to be me and what it means to be a part of my family. And then you insert my family into that graph that we talked about earlier. And you start to see that my individual family history was a catalyst for much of what was happening in the 20th century. The overwhelming Italian immigrant and other immigrant populations were really one of the main catalysts for the historic sites that we have today. And so in my mind, my history and my family, which has always felt marginal to the more important centralized national identities of our history sites, all of a sudden starts to become centered within the context of our history sites. And so if we start to pull out of my green box, and you understand, I'm using my green box as an example of how our personal lives can have a great effect on how we understand our national identity. Just look at these important issues that are brought about by my little old family and those pictures and tapes and handwritten papers in the box. Immigration, migration, and politics. Xenophobia, racism, redlining. Family systems, American exceptionalism and nationalism. Bias and racism in preservation. Labor laws and unions. Human rights and healthcare. Queer LGBTQ experiences and homophobia. Now, who would have ever thought that little green box could be used by a public historian to talk about all of these things? And who would have thought that my family's history could bring about that level of national experience? And so I circle back now to the dismantle preservation. to the Museum of Lynchings and Mass Incarceration, to my family's little green box. And then on the other side, we have those important, valuable, large historic sites, Mount Vernon, Colonial Williamsburg. And then the commodification of our nostalgic Americana, which is just exemplified by Wallace Nutting. And in between those two, I bring back our little book about a barricade. And I ask us to look at what's happening around us socially. And what are the barricades? What's keeping us from blending these two sides together? What's making it difficult for us to see John Guzzo in Mount Vernon?
Funeral for a home will commemorate the lives and the stories that homes contain. Think of your home, think of your house, the stories that are told. This memorial homegoing service will coincide with the building demolition as an opportunity to celebrate the lives of the homes that this home has touched.
When you think back perhaps to the house you grew up in, or a bedroom that was really important to you, there is an emotional tie to that place and to those four walls. And I feel that most people have cared at one point or another for those places that they've lived. Funeral for a Home is an opportunity as both an art project as well as a public history project to reflect on the meaning of our housing stock here in Philadelphia.
Try to think about it as if this is the last year of this home's life. And so this is an opportunity to commemorate the stories and the families that lived in that home, and to give it a proper memorial service.
We are here to remember the past. We are here to reflect on the present. We are here to look for the future.
Do not forget, these words are dynamite. Yes, but have you ever thought of it in this light? And you go ahead.
So that's the end of my formal presentation. That cassette tape actually had to be dismantled and professionally digitized so that I was able to actually hear it because it was so old. That was my grandfather speaking to us about how to be a salesman. He ends that entire tape with, have you ever thought of it in this light? And so I leave you with the same question. Have you ever thought about that object that you picked up in this light? And can you ask yourself these 3 questions about the object that you picked up? And how could that change the way you view and understand history? Thank you so much for inviting me.
Frank, thank you for, as I saw in the chat box, a very thought-provoking session. And we will open it up for questions. You can enter your question into the chat box. You can do the Q&A. And I know Frank is more than happy to continue this conversation. I think Joyce is going to take over, especially since my microphone is acting up on me.
And I understand it's a hard one to actually have questions for. It's more about self-reflection in thinking about how we facilitate history.
Mm-hmm. I'll throw one out. So, whoops. So let's say you've been made CEO of Mount Vernon Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, what's the first thing you would do to maybe change the message going out, or how do you bring about that broader inclusivity?
Yeah, you know, I think what we're seeing right now with most sites is that, and this is, we're really kind of adding the story of the enslaved or adding the story of the servants. Like we understand, or even adding the story of women as part of these historic sites. But they all seem to feel like they're add-ons. And there's a kind of comment right now, which is centering history in your narrative. And that means that whatever you do is not a kind of additive piece. And so that's a long way of answering your question, that for pre-existing sites, it really might be a necessary exercise to reevaluate how it is centered in context. And so, for instance, again, I make a point to not judge any other history sites. I run history sites. It is hard to do, never judging anyone. If anything, my comments are to try to help us all. So please understand that's where I'm coming from, is to think about, for instance, Mount Vernon, not as the home of George Washington. Well, of course, I know this is not going to happen. Not as the home of George Washington, but more as indicative of the green box that I just talked about. And in that way, the site would take on entirely new forms of not just narrative, but also operations, community engagement, all of those sorts of things. But again, I'm not pinpointing Mount Vernon. I'm just saying, for instance, that would be one.
So we did have a question come in. How has the Green Box project changed you?
It has now made me even more clearly dedicated to seeking out the stories and individuals that I don't know about. And that's one reason why bringing in people that are outside your social, cultural, economic, and educational circle are so important, because I wouldn't have known a lot of that information unless that box were handed to me. It's just not something I would have even known to start looking at. And so I use the box as a kind of metaphor for community engagement, and think of that box as the community coming to us in facilitating history sites and saying, this is meaningful to us. now. That's what we need to be looking at. And so that's how it's affected me, that I am searching, constantly searching for that green box at sites.
We have another comment. A lot more coming in, so I'm losing my place. Thinking of Ohio high-style house tours, what if we make the tour of the servants' quarters the main tour? Tour the home as the servants moved around it. Those tours are popular anyway.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. And it goes a little bit back to what I was talking about before. I mean, I am just as guilty as doing this as everybody else. And that is that what we're trying to do is attach narratives onto pre-existing narratives. And when I keep saying centering the narrative, I don't just mean if I come and pay an extra $50. It's also interesting that these marginalized special narratives usually cost more money. So it's kind of interesting that the really central dominant culture narrative is relatively inexpensive compared to special narratives, but really rethinking their entirety. See, when we talk about the servants, I did a one-night stand, and a one-night stand is something I do in Twisted Preservation. I sleep in historic house museums, really use the beds, sit in the furniture, and I search for suppressed stories. I search for narratives that aren't being told. And I was in the Glessner House in Chicago, which is a very high style house. So it's exactly what I think you're talking about. It's a Gilded Age mansion, really extraordinary house. But in researching it, I started to study the servants. And it was the same time that I went to Xenia, because all the tile in the Glessner House came from Xenia. And Glessner was born in Zanesville. Zanesville tile. And Glessner was born in Zanesville. So that's where this connection started. But I was at the Glessner House, and I asked to look at their records of servants. And out of 153 servants, they didn't have a single Italian. And that was over the entire lifespan of the house. So what I would ask you is that mostly Italian immigrants probably produced the brick and tile for that house. But they didn't work there. There'd be no real reason to be talking about them other than if you found the green box for the Glessner House. And so my answer to you is, we'd really want to collaborate on making the house not centered on its, for instance, Gilded Age history, and centered on something else, centered on the complexity and messiness of what I was showing you. So that would be my answer. I mean, certainly you can do servants tours, and you can enter people from the side. I mean, that's been done, but it can be done well. I mean, so it's a very positive step. I would just try to push you to really integrate it even further.
We have a question. I think a mutual friend, Clinton Brown from Buffalo, asks, Frank, are you still seeking to sleep overnight in historic house museums? And he asks, as the master or as the servant?
Yeah, you know, of course I am. I'm really interested in telling these stories that haven't been told. And I'm interested in both. I mean, the one thing that I have shied away from, I did one plantation house, and it was in Mobile, Alabama. It was an urban house that wasn't associated with a plantation, but it was associated with a brick manufacturing plant, which was populated completely by enslaved labor. And I actually wrote the narrative entirely from the perspective of the enslaved, and that effect it had on Mobile. And then Joe McGill, who is a colleague of mine with the Slave Dwelling Project, we've done a project together at Minokan, where in fact, I slept in the ruins of the main house, and he slept in the area where the enslaved, and then we had a joint community piece. So that's the only time that I'm really cautious about doing these things. Otherwise, I'm really interested in, we did the Green Belt outside of Washington, D.C., which was talking about LGBT issues and the issues of the nuclear family, and how the WPA housing units actually forced the notion of families that we have today, that we often hear about politically, and it kept out immigrants because my family had 6 kids. There's no way they could have lived there.
I have another comment from Dan. Thank you for this session. I've been stuck on how our community's historical museum can be better curated to become more personal and valuable to visitors. And this is as valuable a spark, even if or because it does make me feel uncomfortable. Next question.
May I just say something about that?
Or do you want to comment on that?
That my presentation today made me feel uncomfortable. I don't know if you all felt that, but this is a really kind of intimate opening of personal history. So if we want to get to someplace authentic as humans, I think we need to be in that emotional space somehow. And even as facilitators and public historians, I think part of the problem with history sites and part of the reason why they're being tagged and some are being set on fire and statues are being taken down is because the kind of emotional quality of what they represent hasn't really been pushed. It hasn't really been in the narrative. And so I appreciate that, and it makes me uncomfortable also.
Another question. Why do house museums such a persistent way to share local history? What books do you recommend to learn more about the history of the development of house museums?
Yeah, there's one called Domesticating History, which talks about Mount Vernon and Monticello and a few others. And it couldn't be more political and more tied to the cultural state of when they became house museums. And I touch a little bit on that, and I do just want to say that the Anarchist Guide to Historic House Museums was co-written by a dear friend of mine and colleague, Deborah Ryan, and I wouldn't have written that book without Deb, so I just want to make sure that Deb's name is associated with the book. So I mentioned a little bit about that, but I could almost bet that every historic site and house museum that is represented in this community on this line right now has a direct relationship to that chart that I showed in the presentation.
Another question we have. Thank you for this excellent presentation. One of my favorite historians is Robert Caro because he researches by turning every page to find out what really happened. Who are some of your favorite historians?
Well, for me, I mentioned it at the beginning, I'm dyslexic. And so reading is very, very difficult, and my learning comes from doing. It's the reason why I went into architecture as my primary form of education, and I backed into public history. And my reading is now based on my consulting and the work that I do. So there's a kind of interest in it. I tend to not be able to read kind of deep historic things like that. I tend to be very focused with information that I'm looking for, and I rely on others to kind of point me in direction. So I should be asking you that question.
I have a comment from Jessica. My takeaway is using place as an investigation tool and not necessarily the product or result of one narrative, but rather an opportunity to drive dialogue. Thanks.
I think that's absolutely true. For me, the evolution and the accumulation of important historical information that took me from the Guzzo's house along the railroad track with the black lunchbox to Claycraft, to the Glessner house in Chicago, to me writing a one-night stand. That kind of thing is really about an accumulated history that is nonlinear.
Another question. in regards to the chart, when did you make that correlation that home museums and violence and social unrest occurred at the same time?
I was giving a presentation to the Chicago Public Housing Museum, and they asked me to speak about historic house museums and sites in the era of Trump. And I wanted to put into context things that were happening today. And I came into that as a concept, and I just made the connection that they seem to really overlap. And when I started to really do the kind of research, they in fact overlapped. So it really was just kind of primary research in doing that.
Okay, we have a little lull in the questions, which always happens. I'll start to give some closing remarks, and then people will last minute start typing them in. Please do. This afternoon, we have The Building Doctor is our happy hour at 5 o'clock. That is sponsored by Cross Street Partners. Remember to go back into the chat box if you want to get the Anarchist Guide to his historic house museums. There's 2 that we'll be giving away. Tomorrow on, it's tomorrow, Thursday already, August 27th, we have in the morning at 10 o'clock, Truly Inclusive Engagement with Villain Brown, which will be excellent. At 2 o'clock, Jack of All Preservation Trades on entering into preservation trades. And then Thursday afternoon's happy hour at 5 o'clock is Young Professionals Career Advice. You can see Devin put the contest link in the chat box again. I think we might have something else here. Okay. That's just the thing for tomorrow. Okay, any other questions? It was really thought-provoking. I mean, I started in house museums, so I love it too.
Thank you all so much for inviting me.
Okay.
I really am honored.
And I will throw in that having read this, that even if you don't win a copy in the contest today, go to your favorite local bookseller or order it online at Amazon. I mean, honestly, there's right at the beginning, there's the picture of your daughter making fun of the...
Which I think actually, I believe my daughter is on today. I'm not sure, but yeah.
And it goes from there. It's really the whole concept of thought. You go to these house museums, everything's roped off. And, you know, what if you could go to a house museum and actually sit on the painting sofa, and you sat down with the curator and you used the tea set from the, you know, the fine china from the family that was there. It's how do you make the experience more fulfilling for the person who's coming? And you address that in the book, and it's chock full of ideas that a house museum could take today and start using, and help to bridge that gap and help to create a fuller picture of what it means to be a house museum, and what it means in general to be human and to have family and relationships, as you touched on today. So it is a wonderful resource to use and to think about, and then to put thoughts into action.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much.